Welcome to part 2. Here we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 17. As I've stated in part 1, Paul makes the point that Abraham trusted in God and therefore he was called righteous. He didn't have to do anything for that, he just trusted in God and God called him righteous. And Paul is making this point in his relationship to the Gentiles coming into, or the non-Jews coming into the synagogue, in that these people have not been circumcised, they are not keeping the law, but just like Abraham, in a condition of not being circumcised, trusted and was called righteous. Therefore, these non-Jews, in their condition of being uncircumcised, should also, but trusting in God, should also be called righteous. Excuse me. Then he goes on and he starts talking about the promise of the seed. And that's a very, very important part, because we start getting into another principle with the problem of the seed, where Paul starts talking about Abraham's promise of a seed. And we go to Genesis chapter 17 to find out if this is true. Was it a promise or was it not a promise? As I've stated in part 1, to me a promise is a guarantee somebody makes you without expecting anything in return. But if we go to Genesis chapter 17, where the Abrahamic story is unfolding, it says, when Abram was 99 years old, Adonai appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be pure-hearted. I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will increase your numbers greatly. Abram fell on his face, and God continued speaking with him. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. Your name will no longer be Avram, exalted father, but your name will be Avraham, father of many nations, because I have made you the father of many nations. I will cause you to be very fruitful. I will make nations of you. Kings will descend from you. I am establishing my covenant between me and you, along with your descendants after you, generation after generation, as an everlasting covenant to be God for you and for your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land in which you are now foreigners, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. God said to Abraham, as for you, you are to keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, generation after generation. Here is my covenant which you are to keep between me and you, along with your descendants after you. Every male among you is to be circumcised. You are to be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. This will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Generation after generation, every male among you who is 8 days old is to be circumcised, including slaves born within your household and those bought from a foreigner not descended from you. The slave born in your house and the person bought with your money must be circumcised. Thus my covenant will be in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who will not let himself be circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person will be cut off from his people, because he has broken my covenant. Does this sound like a promise? This is a covenant. This is a contract. In order to have a legal contract, you have to have 2 or more parties that both receive something from the contract and give something to the contract, and it must also have a punishment for breaking the contract. This is a legal contract. It can't be a promise, because God is expecting Abraham to do something to circumcise himself and all of the males under his control, and God in return is giving Abraham and his descendants all these blessings. In return, God is getting Abraham's acknowledgement and obedience as his God. So we have the condition here where this is a perfectly legal contract. This is not a promise. Paul tends to make it into a promise, or tries to get people to understand it as a promise, but it's not a promise. Something is expected. Yes, Abraham, before he was circumcised, found favor in God's eyes, and God called him righteous, but that was not the end of it. Abraham had to go on in order to receive everything God had for him by being circumcised and being obedient to God. So the point that Paul is trying to make here is, yes, you should accept these people even though they're not circumcised or keeping the law, because God sees them as righteous. But he fails to go on at this point and say, but they eventually have to be circumcised and keep the law in order to be considered God's people, because God said here, if anyone, any male, refuses to be circumcised, then he's cut off. He is no longer one of my people. He is no longer a descendant of Abraham. Do we consider that only physical, or do we consider that spiritual as well? Well, Paul is making the point that this is a spiritual thing as well as a physical thing, because these people coming in to the synagogues are not descendants of Abraham physically, but he's saying that they're spiritual descendants. And then he's going to go on and to point out eventually that it's also including the circumcision of the heart. But that has been a point in Judaism forever. Back when Mount Sinai came about, he said these words are to be placed in your heart, and as well as being in the flesh. So it was a dual thing, but it was not independent from each other. So in part 3, we're going to go in a little bit more into Romans and see other things that may be considered a problem that people are tending to take out of context and to make a whole doctrine on, when they really need to take the whole letter as one entity and not take one sentence out here and one sentence out there and try to make a doctrine out of that. We need, in other words, we need to see God as he is. We need to see his word as it is and not the way that we want it to be. Shalom. Have a good day and God bless.